So in Chapter 7, we're going to talk about investigating theft acts. And we have a lot of learning objectives. We want to understand ways frauds are investigated, discuss investigation methods for investigating theft acts, understand how to coordinate an investigation. Using a vulnerability chart, we're going to talk about surveillance, the effectiveness of using an invigilation, how to obtain physical evidence, and how to seize and analyze electronic information. So first, before we start an investigation, we consider the strength of the predication. And remember, the predication is the reason to believe that a fraud has occurred. So if we have strong reason to believe that fraud has occurred, then we're more likely to move forward with an investigation. However, if the predication is weak, then we have to decide, okay, with weak predication, what's the cost of the investigation? Is it going to cost us a lot to investigate because it may not be worth it? And then we also want to consider, well, maybe it's weak predication and the cost might be high, but if it did happen, there could be tremendous exposure. So it could cost us a lot of money if this fraud did indeed take place. We could be exposed for a lot. So you consider all these factors when determining whether you're going to go ahead with an investigation. Right? Predication, the strength of it, how strong is do you have a reason to believe that thefts occurred, how much is it going to cost to investigate, and then what's your potential exposure from the fraud loss. And if those are high, obviously you're going to conduct an investigation. When you consider what to investigate, we've talked about this before, we want to talk about the signal that an investigation will send to others in the organization, or the potential signal of a non-investigation. Because if there's high predication and other employees are aware that there's a potential theft act there and you don't investigate, then that lowers the perception of detection at the organization, and you're more likely to have other people attempt to commit fraud. Right? Because the biggest deterrent to fraud is perception of detection. And not acting on credible predication could lead others in your organization to believe that fraud's worth the risk. So you want to consider the cost of the investigation, but also the cost of not doing anything. You also want to consider the risk of investigating versus not investigating. And so, what happens if we investigate? What could we potentially find? But if we don't investigate, what's our exposure? How much could we potentially lose? Right? And we also want to consider the public exposure or the loss of reputation if this gets out. So maybe we don't really want to investigate because we just don't want the word to get out that employees have stolen from us because it might hurt our reputation. So those are things to consider. But again, we also have to factor in the signal that we send for not investigating. Then finally, we consider the nature of the possible fraud. How serious is it, and how much could we potentially lose? So once we've determined that there is predication and there is reason to go forward to conduct an investigation, so we want to first consider who's potentially involved, how could they be doing it, what internal controls are being violated, and then how much, what's the size of the fraud, how much could we be exposed to here. And so those are all questions when we start the investigation. And we're going to discuss ways that we can answer these questions to decide how we want to move forward. But when we start the fraud investigation, as the circle shows here, we don't want to interview the suspect first. So the first thing, and usually when we start the investigation, we don't always know who the suspect is. So we're going to start by asking questions. So if we suspect that there's theft from the warehouse, then we want to work from the outside of the circle down to the center to the potential suspect. So we'll check personnel records or company records potentially to find out who's working in the warehouse at the time. If this is a potential kickback scheme where our buyers are buying product from our vendor and they're approving high prices for the vendor's giving them a kickback, then searching those personnel records to find out who our buyers are, who's dealing with our vendors. We could talk to former employees and other vendors that have been unsuccessful purchasing from us to find out what they found out, why the reasons that they've been given that their bids or their product prices have been unsuccessful. They said talking to former employees, find out what they thought. And then searching public records, we're going to talk about how to do an invigilation and then surveillance. And then we'll interview others. And then once we've gathered all the information and we think that we have identified the suspect, then we'll want to interview the suspect. But we don't want to interview the suspect before we have enough evidence that we think we can get the suspect to confess. Because once we interview the suspect and we start asking questions, they're going to know that we're onto them, right? And so they're going to clam up, and if we don't get the confession out of them, then it may be very difficult from that time forward, because the suspect will potentially destroy evidence and to make it very difficult to continue the investigation going forward. So we don't want to interview the suspect until the very end. And then we want to have enough evidence that when we confront them, that we feel like the evidence that we have is strong enough to overcome their denials and ultimately get them to confess that they indeed did commit the fraud. So we start from the outside and slowly move in towards the suspect. So what are the methods that we can investigate the fraud act? And if you remember, we talked about the fraud element triangle. There's the act itself, there's the concealment, and then there's the conversion. So if somebody had stolen inventory from the warehouse, there's the act itself, and we could potentially catch that individual through surveillance or some other means that we're going to talk about. But if we don't catch them in the act, then most likely when people try and commit fraud, they cover it up some way. So maybe they're writing off that inventory to scrap. So when they do the inventory counts, the inventory is also off the books so that the counts are not different from the books. So if they're writing off to scrap and we see an increase of scrap, that would be an investigation into concealment, right? And then if they're stealing the inventory from the warehouse, they eventually have to sell it online or to a pawn shop or to somebody else to convert it to cash, and that's the conversion portion. So we can find our inventory, stolen inventory up on eBay. For example, a way to catch them in conversion. In this chapter, we're talking about the theft act itself. So one of the ways that we use to actually catch people in the act is doing surveillance. So we could actually personally monitor the warehouse, or we could put cameras up and do video surveillance. We'll talk about more about surveillance and covert operations, and also invigilations, how to obtain physical evidence and gathering electronic evidence. So when we first start the fraud investigation, we want to develop a hypothesis about what could be going on. And we could do that by developing a vulnerability chart. And if you look at remember this box, it says a vulnerability chart is a tool that coordinates the assets that were taken, individuals who had theft opportunities, investigation methods, concealment and conversion possibilities, symptoms observed, pressures, rationalizations, and key controls that had to be compromised. So these are all the things that we're going to put on a vulnerability chart to help us guide the investigation. So in this vulnerability chart, if you look at first what was taken, well, there was a computer deposit. Who had the opportunity? The teller, operations officer, proof operator. How are the assets moved? Right? And so you just move across this vulnerability chart across columns here, and this will help you identify who's potentially involved, based on the red flags and the key controls, the rationalizations, the pressures. We're going to put all these onto a vulnerability chart, and then looking at this chart is going to help us determine, okay, who's potentially involved, why are they doing it, and how are they doing it. And this is going to be the key to developing our hypothesis about, is this fraud actually happening, and if so, who's involved. By looking at this vulnerability chart and assessing the red flags, then we're able to best identify who the potential suspects are. And this is more vulnerability charts for like a different theft act. In this case, goods were delivered and they were stolen, who had the opportunity, receiving, trucker, how the assets were moved, right? So we can flow down this list, look at all the various columns and find out what the red flags are, possible motives, and help us identify a suspect and the means by which they're committing fraud, and that'll help guide our fraud investigation. So if we suspect, for example, that somebody in the warehouse is stealing our inventory, and like I said, we could do surveillance. So we could sit outside the warehouse and monitor it and sort of register, write down all the cars that come in and out of the parking lot. I didn't notice if any goods are being loaded up into one of the cars or into a truck, right? And then so write down and identify everything that we see. And there's two types of surveillance. We can do stationary or fixed point. That's where we're sitting there kind of behind a bush, watching everything that happens at that warehouse, right? See all the trucks, monitoring all the trucks that come in and out, back up to the warehouse, etc. Or we can do moving or tailing surveillance. This is extremely rare in fraud investigation. This is more law enforcement type techniques. That's actually where, like if the truck were to come in, we feel like it was loaded up with stolen inventory, and we follow the truck to wherever it goes and then see them unloading on the inventory and where they're taking it, etc. So following or tailing it can be very dangerous, and it's normally done by professionals. When we mean professionals, it means law enforcement. I mean, there are people who specialize in this. There's fraud investigators that do this type of work. People that do repossessions do this type of work. But for the most part, it's people who have it's either law enforcement or people with law enforcement background. We don't typically get involved in the moving or tailing surveillance, but we do occasionally get involved in stationary or fixed point surveillance. Like if we want to monitor a warehouse and see what's going on, we might fix somebody outside to do that. What's more common is to do electronic surveillance, where we just post a video camera, and then we monitor everything that happened inside the warehouse or even outside the warehouse over a period of time when we think the fraud's going to be perpetrated. So this video surveillance is a methodology, is a fraud investigation method to actually catch people in the act. And so occasionally we do catch people in the act. Most of the time for fraud investigations we catch them in concealment, but this is a methodology to catch them in the act of committing the fraud. Another way to determine what your potential exposure is to a fraud and also potentially catch people in the act is performing an invigilation. And that's where you've determined that you have predication that a fraud's occurring. So, and there's some really good examples in your book. I think there's 3 pretty good examples of an invigilation. And I encourage you to read the end of the chapter case about Northern Exposure and the invigilation that they did there. And in that case demonstrates several of these fraud techniques. But an invigilation occurs when you suspect that fraud's happening, and it's large-scale fraud. And so what you do is, for a period of time, for 2 weeks to a month, you make it impossible for somebody to steal. So you bring in a bunch of auditors. They monitor every single transaction. They don't let employees do anything without supervision. And then you figure out after the invigilation, you compare the invigilation period to periods before the invigilation period to see if your net income, for example, goes up during the invigilation period. Because if you think employees are stealing from you on a regular basis, and there's examples in your book where there were situations where there's like an auto shop where they didn't think, where they thought their net income wasn't nearly as high as it should be, and so they suspected that people working in this auto shop, in this mechanic shop, were stealing from. The owner thought they were stealing from him. So basically, during a 2-week or a month period, they made it impossible for them to steal. They had auditors sort of swarming this auto repair shop, and every single transaction was reviewed by a CPA. And so during that period of invigilation, the number of cash payments by customers went from, I think, 7% to 15%, so basically doubled during that period, and net income went up significantly. And so what they determined was that employees were stealing cash before the invigilation period. And I think, the excuse or the reason that they gave that they're going to have the CPA monitoring every transaction was that the owner said they were thinking about selling the shop, and they needed somebody to monitor it, to verify what the cash receipts and revenues for a month, so that they could provide that information to the potential buyer. And then after the invigilation period, they told the employees that the deal fell through, and that they weren't going to sell the shop, and then things went back to normal, and then cash receipts went back down to again closer to 7%. Then the owner realized that there must have been The employees must have been stealing cash before and after the invigilation. And so, like I said, the invigilation period is when you put strict temporary controls that are implemented. And then you compare the amount of net income before the invigilation and then during the invigilation to see if your income and your sales volume goes up. And if it does, then it's an indication that employees are stealing from you, and it helps you assess the size of the potential theft act. So just like the diagram here shows that you keep detailed records for 2 months to 2 weeks to a month before an invigilation, then you do the invigilation for 2 weeks to a month. We make it almost impossible for the employees to steal, and then after the invigilation, you relax things again, and then you see where things go, right? And if there's the most net income, very little evidence of stealing during the invigilation period, then it gives you a sense that, yeah, their employees are stealing from you. It doesn't always give you exactly what's happening or who's doing what. So the hard evidence you need potentially to figure out what employees are involved. But it does give you an indication of the size and scope of the theft that you can then use to conduct further investigation. So the other methodology to catch people in the act is actually getting hard physical evidence. So this involves, like the slide says, analyzing objects such as inventory, assets, and broken locks. So if people are stealing from the warehouse and you find broken locks in the warehouse, that's physical evidence that something happens. We don't use as much physical evidence in a fraud investigation. That's more in other criminal activities like murder and other things like that, where there's breaking and entry and other things where there might be fingerprints or footprints, grease stains and other things like that might be able to track to the car where the inventory was loaded onto. That does happen a little bit in a fraud investigation, where there might actually be some physical evidence that we can point to. So, for example, maybe people are stealing from the warehouse and they continue to drive the same truck, and that truck leaks oil and leaves certain tire tracks, and we can investigate those tire tracks. But again, that's more of a law enforcement technique. And but it is possible, especially if we're conducting an investigation with law enforcement or with former law enforcement personnel, that resembles more of a traditional crime. What is common, though, in terms of physical evidence is searching computers. So we could spend a whole chapter or whole course on computer investigation methods, and I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions specifically about the how to use the computer to conduct an investigation, but I'm going to ask just general questions and things that we're going to cover today. But getting computer searches can help you find those emails where maybe your buyer is emailing the vendor and saying, "Hey, if I approve these higher prices, will you give me this kickback?" And you find emails and things that implicate your employees as being complicit in one of these kickback schemes. So you'd get that information potentially by searching that employee's computer. And so how do you do it? Well, the first step, right, is you have to secure the device and perform the initial test. So if they're using work computer, then you have every right to seize that computer and search it, because it technically belongs to the company. You wouldn't be able to seize their personal computer or go to their home without a warrant or a search warrant. But if you're looking at computers that the company owns, even if there's personal information on that computer, you're perfectly justified in searching it. So what you want to do is obviously search the computer when the employee is not there, so in the middle of the night. So you want to secure the device, the computer itself, and you want to clone the hard drive, and then you want to search it yourself. And we'll talk about sort of the way this works, right? So if it's a corporate computer or a company's computer, then you have a right to search it. Right? But when you do search it, well, you still have to maintain a chain of custody. So just like you're gathering other types of evidence, maybe it's documentary evidence, you have to be able to show at some point, because forensic accounting, by definition, this evidence that you're gathering may wind up in court. And so you need to be able to show the chain of custody and that the hard drive that you seized and made a copy of is the exact same hard drive that in the exact same format that you found it in when you originally seized it. So you want to take pictures of the seizure site and have a neutral witness at the scene, and then you want to turn the computer off by cutting the power to the machine. You don't want to power it down, because what happens is when you do the normal power down function, then it clears out cache and clears out temporary files and other things, and you potentially lose evidence. So you want to cut the power to the machine, and then you want to clone the hard drive itself, and then to be able to show in court later on that this is the exact same hard drive, this clone that you made is an exact clone of the one that you searched. There's what they call a bit-for-bit copy, and then you can calculate a CRC checksum. Now, I'm not going to ask you how that works, but that's just the technology that IT specialists use to be able to show in court later on that this is the actual clone, an exact copy of the hard drive that you seized at the employee's workstation. So then you want to seal the original, and then you want to do all your investigation on a clone copy. It's the same thing you would do with documentary evidence. You're going to make a copy of the evidence and then put the original in a plastic cover, and then not use it until you want to present it into court. It's the same thing with a drive. You want to search the clone copy and seal away the original, so that way you can show in court the original drive and that the clone that you searched was the exact same. And the way you do that is these CRC checksum, and if you've done a bit-for-bit copy, but again, I'm not going to ask you specifically about the technique, just in general what you have to do. And again, part of those IT processes that you go through is doing a cyclic redundancy check, and that creates a number, and then that helps you show that in court that you didn't tamper with the evidence or tamper with the hard drive. So the court will actually have confidence that that you got the exact same copy. The copy that you're searching is the exact same hard drive that you seized. So the two primary checksum methods that are used are MD5 and SHA1 algorithms. Again, I'm not going to ask you questions about these checksum methods, but that's how investigators use, and that's the terminology that they use. So if you hear it in the future, you know, sort of on a cursory level what exactly they're doing. So when you actually get the clone copy of the hard drive and you start doing the searches, then you want to look at computer logs, right? Obviously for web activity, see what they've been looking at on the web. Recent files from the start menu, look at their web favorites. Obviously searching their browser history is going to give you a lot of information about what they're searching, what they're looking at. And then obviously the easiest place to go, and the most obvious place where people are going to hide or have their own personal information and potentially information about the fraud scheme, is a documents folder. So you go into My Documents and see what they have stored. Look at the different files that they have. And clearly looking at their trash and recycle bin, see what they're throwing away. Right? Because even when you put things in the recycle bin, it's not necessarily gone. You actually have to empty the bin. But even if you empty the bin, the information's still there. It's just that what's happened when you delete files is you've just told the computer that when they need that space, they can overwrite it with something else. But the file doesn't actually ever go away until it gets overwritten by something else. So computer forensics can find deleted files as well. Then we also don't want to forget to look around their workstation and look for USB drives, CDs, and other media found, because they may be storing the information on temporary drives, and so you want to make copies of those as well. Then looking for recently loaded files in the file menu, looking for chat logs, and then email caches. So we want to search their email. Maybe they've deleted their email, but it's still in the cache. But even if they deleted the email, there's still ways to go back and find that email. Because it's possible that the email is still on the server. It's possible that the email is still at on the other person's email address in their inbox. It's also possible that even though they deleted the email, there's a prior version of it that that was replied to that's still available. So the software packages that we use to search these hard drives, there's guidance software's In-Case Forensic Edition. There's Access Data's Forensics Toolkit, which is a pretty common kit that investigators use. And again, they use this software to search through and analyze data that's on a hard drive. And then there's open source packages like eFence, Inks Helix, and Backtrack Linux's Backtrack. Now, again, I'm not going to ask you about questions about the forensic software packages and how they actually use them, but just get an idea of what type of software is out there that does that. And again, like I said, with emails, many of the copies of these emails exist. So the sender and receiver have copies of the emails potentially on the server. And then, like I said, it's also a possibility that even though they deleted a later email, that an earlier version that was replied to is still on their system. The thing that's hard is if they're using web-based email, and oftentimes fraudsters know that they're better off using web-based email, so they don't use the employer email. They'll use Yahoo Mail or Gmail, and that's more difficult to search because those emails are actually stored on Yahoo or Google servers. So in order able to get access to that email information, you have to subpoena Yahoo or Google. So you can't just access it through the employer system. So that's a little bit more difficult, but it's not impossible to get that information. So that's the end of chapter 7, and we'll move on to the next chapter.